Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you. I hope you're all safe and well. It is an immense pleasure and an honor for me to introduce today's PPE Ethics Institute speaker. Michele Moody-Adams is currently Joseph Strauss Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia University, where she served as Dean of Columbia College and Vice President for Undergraduate Education from 2009 to 2011. Before Columbia, Professor Moody-Adams taught at Cornell University, Wellesley College, the University of Rochester, and Indiana University. She knows our area well, as she did her undergraduate studies at Wellesley College, then earned a second BA from Oxford University and came back to Cambridge to pursue a MA and PhD in philosophy from Harvard University, where she wrote a dissertation on David Hume's moral philosophy under the supervision of John Rawls. She has been a British Marshall Scholar, an NEH Fellow, and is a lifetime honorary Fellow of Somerville College, Oxford. Professor Moody-Adams specializes in moral, social, political, and legal philosophy and has authored dozens of academic articles in these areas. She's also the author of a brilliant book on moral relativism, Fieldwork in Familiar Places, Morality, Culture, and Philosophy, which came out in 2002. In it, Professor Moody-Adams shows we can take moral disagreement seriously while retaining our aspirations for moral objectivity. She has published widely on equality, social justice, moral psychology, gender, and race. Professor Moody-Adams' current work focuses on academic freedom, equal educational opportunity, democratic disagreement, progress, and the ethics of public monuments. Her forthcoming book with Columbia University Press is entitled Making Space for Justice, Social Movements, Collective Imagination, and Political Hope. I cannot wait to read it. Today, she will tell us whether democracy has a future. Please join me in welcoming Michele Moody-Adams.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'll look forward to taking questions from everyone after the talk. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have a presentation PowerPoint that I hope will be enlightening for you. And it starts with a picture that tells you how much I wish I could be there with you, the empty chairs, instead of me being there in person. The title of the talk today is Does Democracy Have a Future? And I'm going to try to give a positive answer to that question. I hope you'll think I make a good case for it. But I'm going to start by talking about the reasons for which people even ask the question. And two of the critical questions they ask are whether democratic values, especially liberty. You know what I've realized? I've actually got the wrong version of the PowerPoint here. I'm going to go ahead with it anyway. It's fine. Do democratic values, especially liberty and equality, lead democracies to destroy themselves from within? One of the person who thinks yes is Plato. And some of you may have read Plato's Republic. The argument that he makes in book 8 there starts from the assumption that when we care too much about liberty, we become kind of licentious. We let our desires amplify and become, in effect, take over every other important rational concern. And when we care too much about equality, we end up not holding our leaders to standards that any good ruler of a political community ought to live up to. So we get terribly inefficient and ineffective leadership. When it gets to the absolute worst, Plato says we end up needing somebody to save us, and we end up tending towards a preference for tyranny. So that's one of the dangers that Plato worries about. And then there's this question of whether ordinary democratic citizens might actually be incapable of governing in their own interests. I'm going to here giving you two very famous examples of this argument. One of them was made by a man who was originally actually an advertising agent and then went into journalism, named Walter Lippmann, who wondered whether the world was just too complex and the sources of information we had for knowing about it just too narrow and limited, and that we could be easily manipulated by propaganda and so forth. And if you can't have genuine knowledge about the complexity of the world and your place in it, how can you purport to work together with other people whose knowledge of their own interests and so forth is equally limited? So Walter Lippmann worried about that. And then in the 1940s, this particularly 1942, a famous economist who also ended up doing political theory named Joseph Schumpeter made probably the most skeptical argument. People who write about this today are actually just echoing him. He thought that we just were not good for anything except basically voting in the people who should govern us. And if they do a bad job, voting them out. He did not think we should purport to take on the challenge of trying to satisfy our collective interests ourselves. And so that's a worry that is a long-standing sort of theoretical worry. But I found, and I think I'm not alone in being concerned about this, that there are also contemporary worries about changes in how we communicate with each other, both the things that make us tend not to talk to people in ordinary ways anymore. It's mediated by electronic equipment and by technology. But when we use the technology, we tend to interact with people in very limited ways. We don't listen often to people who disagree with us. We create what they call these filter bubbles that make it hard for us to really how we work. So even before the pandemic, remote work, for instance, was becoming more common. But it turns out that the workplace is one of the places where people sometimes interact in informal ways. They exchange knowledge, sometimes across class lines and so forth. And remote working cuts us off, the worry is, from some forms of communication that might be critical to political life. Then there are changes in how we treat each other. This is actually a still photo from an event that took place, I believe it was last week, at a Bath and Body Works store where people got mad with each other about who was and who wasn't wearing a mask, and they're in line and they're not far enough, and they end up in a fight. And this sense that we've lost the ability to think that we might be able to relate to each other as civic friends, as people from whom we might learn, even when we disagree with them, has been undermined. There's a kind of coarseness and mistrust, and even a tendency towards excessive violence in our interactions, ordinary interactions. So a lot of people are wondering whether there is room anymore for genuine commitment to democratic life. And I'm going to add here, I'm going to put John Dewey's name up, but I had another slide that I had changed, I added in last minute, and I have the wrong version here. What's also happened is that I'm going to take Dewey's made us able to trust in democratic institutions, to trust in political elites and political parties, have been undermined actually by a lot of bad behavior and a lot of inattention and concern on the part of political elites for the well-being of the people they represent. I'll also add that if you live, as most of us do, in multicultural, complex societies where people immigrate from other countries where they might speak a different language, might have slightly different cultural traditions, a lot of contemporary democracies now have what they call identity crisis around how to think about the internal diversity in their midst. And globalization, taking place around them has added to the challenge, and we haven't figured out how to handle that. And then there is economic stagnation. People are concerned in a decline in people's living standards that's making them unable to even make an ordinary living in an ordinary way. And people are less and less likely to believe that democracy is working for them. This has led to something called democratic deconsolidation. When something is consolidated, it comes together in a coherent whole. But now all the things that kept democracies together are weakening, and democracies may be breaking up in terrible and interesting ways. Now, there have always been thinkers. John Dewey, the philosopher I'm going to talk about, has always been one of them, who thought that some of the skepticism about whether democracies could survive was not just overstated, but wrong. And Dewey was somebody who actually had an ongoing argument with that fellow Walter Lippmann, the journalist writing in the 1920s. But he was somebody who thought very deeply about the relationship between theory and practice, about how we could reshape our lives in order to reinvigorate democratic institutions. And at one of the most distressing points in human history, actually, not just in Western history, the late 1930s, when fascism and Nazism and various kinds of totalitarianism were on the rise, Dewey actually said maybe there's some things we could do by changing our attitude about what democracy requires in order to persist and persist functioning well, that might help change it. I love this quotation, and I'll say a little bit about each element of it, but let me read it out first. He says, the depth of the present crisis as if democracy were something that perpetuated itself automatically, as if our ancestors in any particular country, but in the US, obviously the so-called founding fathers, as though they had succeeded in setting up a machine that somehow solved the problem of perpetual motion in politics. And you know, perpetual motion machines are devices that people believed could be designed to never stop. Once you set them in motion, that idea seems to violate the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, but people still hold out this hope. And Dewey says it's not possible in physics and it's not possible in politics. Something that we do has got to change if democracy is actually going to survive. It's not a perpetual motion machine in politics. And this wonderful essay, it's not a very long essay. If you are interested in Dewey, you can actually find this online, Creative Democracy, the Task Before Us. Even though it's written in 1939, it reads like something that you could have seen somebody write in 2021. We are perhaps in the same kind of crisis, I hope not quite as severe. Before that, Dewey had also written in 1922 a book called The Public and Its Problems, taking on the arguments of Walter Lippmann. But I'm going to draw on some aspects of Dewey's confidence and even his optimism and faith in human beings that there are ways in which we can change what we do and we can make democracy in some ways a new and newly vigorous form of political life. So I'm asking the question whether we can renew and reinvigorate democracy. I've actually have a book that I've been working on. I put it in the background when I got the interest in social movements, actually, that was strengthened, in fact, this summer of 2020. But I remain interested in it. And so this is drawing on some of the ideas that come out of that project I have been working on. So one of my additionally favorite quotations, I think useful to people at every juncture of their lives, is that he says, democracy is a way of life, a way of personal life, not just a set of institutions outside of us, but a way of personal life that has to be controlled not merely by faith in human nature. So you have to believe that people can make democratic governance work, but also in the capacity of human beings for intelligent judgment and action. But these things will not actually come to fruition and reveal their potential unless we've shaped the proper conditions in which people exercise judgment. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what we need to do to reshape some of those conditions and at least to understand what they are. So another more recent quotation that I've come to take very seriously, it's actually from a volume. It's from a volume called the Oxford Handbook of Political Behavior. You could even say it's a lot about political psychology. What are the sort of psychological sources of the behavior that makes institutions work or not work? And the editors of this volume have this wonderful, very short, but I think very informative essay where they make the claim the word wellspring just means source. So they say that one might claim that the wellspring of politics, so the source of politics, flows from the attitudes and behaviors of the ordinary citizen. And the work that I've been doing on democracy and democratic life is really trying to take these two quotations seriously and then trying to figure out how we would rethink our political activities and even how we understand what democratic government is in line with the ideas defended here. So let me say what I think is important. It's a little more text here than I'd intended to give you, but I think we can make this work. Complex democracies, on my view, contain several levels. We tend to think it's all about the people we elect to go to Congress or to be in the White House, or the people who get appointed to the Supreme Court in the American context, in Parliament and in a parliamentary system, et cetera. But in fact, it has three levels of decision-making and action. And the argument that I make is that democratic governance works well. In fact, it may work only if, it may not work at all, unless democracies function well at all three levels. So there's first the decisions and actions of the political class. And I've already given you some examples of this. I talked about, the legislators we elect and the president we vote for in the US system every 4 years. If you're in Britain, you vote for members of parliament, and then they select the prime minister, or, officially they quote unquote select the prime minister from that group. And of course, what they do is important, right? They make laws, they judge the constitutionality of laws, they execute important political decisions. Think about the pandemic, right? You couldn't do anything constructive around such a large scale problem unless the political class was doing its part. But then there's something called middle democracy. And in a moment, I will give you the actual reference to the work from which this concept is drawn. But this is a very interesting level of democratic life. Let me give you a few examples. Things like a board of governors at a major corporation, where they sit down and they make decisions that affect what happens to stockholders, but also indirectly affect what happens to you and me, given how the company will or won't be able to function based on their decisions. So it used to be thought that only the stockholders' interests matter. But in fact, if you are on one of these boards and you're saying, oh, the company should make this product and not that, or charge this, and you approve it, you're affecting people's lives. If you serve as a citizen member of a hospital board, where you're making sure the hospital is doing its business right, does it treat people right in the emergency room, et cetera. If you join, when you leave Northeastern, if you join a professional association that helps you figure out how to get ahead in your workplace and in your career, that's also middle democracy. So when Professor Delmas and I are together in the American Philosophical Association, we're making decisions that help shape education for thousands, hundreds of thousands of students around the country. That's middle democracy. You don't elect those people, but what they do affects you too. And then there's something, I call it here quotidian. Quotidian just means every day, but it also means essentially citizen level. And that's a form of democracy I'm going to say a lot more about on the following slide. We tend to think that what we do in our everyday quotidian lives, citizen level activity, we tend to think, oh, it's just me being my private self. And, I vote every 4 years or every 2 years or whatever. If I get called for jury service, I do that. And that's it. That's the extent of my responsibility, so to speak, to the democracy. But it's actually not sufficient. So you see here that the phrase middle democracy comes from the work of a pair of political philosophers. One is Amy Gutmann, the other is Dennis Thompson. Actually, Amy Gutmann is currently president of the University of Pennsylvania. And then here on the other side, you see with the 2 asterisks, I put citizen level and I thought about changing it for you, but maybe quotidian is just good. It means every day. And I think that helps capture the sense. So this is something I developed in an article from about 2018 on compromise. But you're going to want to know more about this. And so I think it makes sense to look at the various, I'll put them all up and then we'll talk about them separately. So at one level, there's what I like to call the kind of officially governed powers and privileges of citizenship. So you vote because this political system sets up institutions legally that allow you, and there's certain qualifications that you have to meet. At a certain age, you can vote, and you vote in your place of residence, et cetera. You get called for jury service. Those are the official privileges of citizenship that we're all familiar with, right? But I think there's something equally important about what happens. So I call this participatory citizen feedback. I've drawn this from another political philosopher named Elizabeth Anderson. This is important because if somebody stops you in the street and says, sign my petition for so-and-so to be able to run for office, or sign my petition to get this particular policy discussed at the national level, or they call you on the phone to take part in a poll, or you get upset with something that happens. This is a lot of Professor Delmas's work. You're worried about injustice, or you're worried about some important issue that ought to be on the public radar screen, so to speak. And you might take up political protest. That's you acting in one domain of democratic governance. Elizabeth Anderson thinks that. And when I read her work, I thought, she's absolutely right. That's part of your role as a citizen. Then there's this phenomenon that the sociologist Michael Lipsky, is also a political scientist, discussed in a famous book. It's been reissued a lot over the years, called Street Level Bureaucracies. A lot of the interaction that we as ordinary people have with the government on a regular basis comes through services that are provided by people that we don't elect. We don't elect the police force. We don't elect teachers who come and teach people's children in a public school. We don't elect the person who sits in the office if you go to get a marriage license, or you want to buy a house and you need your deed. We don't elect those people, but this work they do is part of the bureaucracies of government. It's provided by ordinary people, but it is deeply, deeply important for those ordinary people to do it right and to think about public goals and aims when they do it. That's very critical. Finally, there's the level of activity at the everyday level. I call the level of private services with public political consequences. So if you own a hotel, you're a hotelier with maybe 2 or 3 hotels in a chain. You say, oh, that's my private business. I do what I want there. Well, the government says, rightly, no, you can't, because if people need to move around in their society, they need to travel maybe for work or for a health reason, right? If you need to go visit a doctor in another city, or if you are someone who needs to see family and you need to stay on the way, or you just want a vacation, right? Those public accommodations need to be provided if you are being respected as a citizen in a way that echoes the public political values we share: equality of access, equality of opportunity, et cetera. And we sometimes forget, this is the debate about the people who own things like cake shops, and do they have to serve some people rather than others? The decisions that have sometimes been made in the public realm in some countries have been the sources of great disagreement, but the underlying principles ought to be, if they govern public accommodations and you as an ordinary citizen want to use them, the other ordinary citizens who own them have a duty. It's shaped by their membership in this political society you share, a duty to operate on the same principles that the government operates, which is treat you equally, respect your liberty, and respect your independence as a citizen. So we think these are all about ordinary everyday life, right? Or if I teach a public class in a public school, I can't say, oh, I don't want to teach the boys in my class anymore because I'm a feminist. I have to teach everybody, right? Because that's what equality requires. And I'm an ordinary citizen, but I have a quasi-public role in that capacity. To work well when we recognize that it has to be grounded in 3 things, and those 3 things have to be strong. One of them is a robust sense of shared identity. This kind of scares us a little bit because we think that a shared identity has to be exclusionary, But there are two things we can say. At the very end, I'm going to come back to the ways we can guarantee that it isn't exclusionary. But we have to have, in a society that demands a lot of us, right? If you own the hotel, you can't just do what you want to do. You've got to think about the public good. It's asking a lot of us. So for that to be possible, we have to have a sense that we have something at stake in this shared political project, rooted in shared history and traditions, and to respect people who share it with us, their fellow citizens. That has to be strong. I'm going to suggest it has to be strong, but it has to be open to internal diversity, and it has to be respectful of the other that isn't part of it, but it has to be strong. The philosopher Charles Taylor thinks that. We also need a sense of democratic fraternity. This one's a little harder. I actually think, sorry, I think this one is so hard because we forget one thing. One of the things that makes us feel we have common interests at stake and that everybody else takes them seriously is when people show you that they take them seriously. One of the most important ways they can show you that is that they're willing to give something up. They're willing to do a little bit of sacrifice in order to make the shared project work. Now, the temptation is to think that sacrifice of a political sort is all about fighting and war. For me, that's even the smallest part of it, right? I'm myself more on the pacifist side than the militarist side anyway. So I think the most of the sacrifice that matters is the everyday sacrifice, right? When, if you know that some people's children don't have enough to eat, and then you elect people whose best way to respond to that problem is to support public welfare, you have to give a little up to do that. But when you give that little up in your taxes, right, you're showing, amongst other things, your willingness to sacrifice. I actually think most democracies would be stronger, in fact, if everybody at the age of 19, 20, or whatever had to do some kind of public service in a critical public mission. But that's just me talking. And we need a strong democratic civic ethos. What is such a civic ethos? It is in part, or in the whole rather, a way of life and a set of understandings about how that life matters that makes us willing to cultivate in people we have the capacity to educate, but also to develop and perfect in ourselves a set of qualities and virtues, I'll say, traits of character that make it easier for us to cooperate in democracy. At the top is that we value civic sacrifice. And it's not, again, it's not just about a war, but it's about if people speak their mind and you disagree, sometimes you have to sit and listen. You may want to walk away. That's another option. But tolerance turns out to be one of those things that comes out of a value of civic sacrifice, just as much as supporting, say, policies that enable people who are less well off to function well. I think we need to seek political compromise. Many Western democracies now function in a way that makes this harder when people have to campaign, maybe especially in the American context, all the time, and you're always seeking campaign donations. The temptation is to express your position in the most extreme way, but that is a temptation that makes us unable to see the value of compromise, and we need to remember that. We need to cultivate concern for social justice. That's gotten harder in the world that's terribly individualistic that many of us inhabit, but it's going to turn out to be critical to getting people who aren't well off to collaborate and cooperate with those who are. They need to feel they belong. And you show you belong when you're willing to cooperate on terms that they feel respect them and are fair as well. We need to promote civic trust. This is trust in each other. The people standing in the line at Bath and Body Works should not be fighting with each other over I mean, they were on the floor. You can go online and see the video. We need to learn how to forego resentment when things don't go our way, or when we think someone is believing, holding values that we disagree with. We need to find ways to forego resentment. We need to forego self-righteousness when we, in fact, are in charge of something. If our political party wins out, say, in a contest, instead of a general willingness to be gracious to other people, to extend, I call it civic goodwill. This means that you are ready to say, you know, maybe they're not out to get me when they win an election. Or maybe if they think it's a good thing for me to contemplate wearing a mask in public, they're asking me for a public purpose that I could find valuable. And again, the point about when you win, not being willing to think it's your job then to try to crush the other side. I think these are critical values. And so, oops, sorry, oh, good. And then it seems to me that the question arises as to how you make people care about that democratic civic ethos, about cultivating it, about thinking that you know what it means to actually achieve each of those 7 virtues or values I cited. And I actually think, so it comes up in the reverse order, but it comes up in that order because I want you to see the building blocks of democratic civic life, what this means. At the bottom of what this sort of triangle of democratic life is what we need to do to make people able to engage in democratic interaction in a more healthy way going forward. We need to find ways. Maybe it's through education, maybe it's through things like media. Facebook finds all kinds of ways to divide us, but could they find ways to provide opportunities for conversations where we sat down with each other and maybe we had an opportunity to read a book about some experience that isn't ours, or to see a movie with a group of people who aren't all like us, and we have to consider some possibility that we'd ruled out. So maybe if you're a very wealthy person and you think, oh, well, poor people all deserve to be poor, you might learn how to consider the possibility that most people who are very poor are not that way because they deserve it, but because they didn't get certain opportunities that even the most ambitious person in the well-off class depends upon in order to do well in life. The second level, moderate stakes opportunities to engage in difficult conversations. This would be harder, and I'll give you an example of where this actually happened. In 1994, actually in the Boston area, I can't remember which of the Planned Parenthood offices it was, but there was a terrible act of violence where someone who had a very strong anti-abortion stand went and took a gun and shot some of the people who worked in the clinic. I think one of them died. It was a high, tension moment. And with the help of a group called the Public Conversations Project, I believe they still exist, but more of those groups exist now. They sat down with leaders in a lot of the religious communities and then the communities of people, women's groups and so forth who had supported abortion, as well as groups that had opposed it. And they said, you gotta fix this, at least help to lower the volume. And they sat down for about 15 months, I believe it was, without anybody knowing they were doing it. And because there would have been disapproval maybe on all sides, but when each time they would have one of these conversations and they would see that their opponents were people of goodwill, even though they disagreed, it turns out they would go back to their local organizations and they would say, you can't be this angry in public life. You can't, for instance, be pro-life and shoot somebody, or you can't say, that you are interested in well-being and not ask what it means when someone maybe decides to go ahead and have a child instead of having an abortion. And people need to debate the argument more quietly. Then there have to be, I think, higher stakes opportunities to engage at the level of citizen democracy, citizen level democracy, to do what some theorists of what's called deliberative democracy have developed, which is called citizen assemblies around difficult policy questions, where they sit ordinary people down, lots of different walks of life. They provide them with information about the particular policy question. They might bring an expert or two in, but the expert would not be there to make the decision. The people themselves have to do it. They are learning here how to collect information, how to process it, how to figure out what is important and what isn't. And I think if we do, at least at every level, some of the low stakes, moderate stakes, and high stakes activities that require people to talk to each other across politically divisive lines and maybe even sometimes make important decisions, I think we would be able to strengthen and repair some of the damaged bonds that are keeping us apart. And I think, it would take the cooperation of news media, once a week on CNN or Fox News or wherever, people have one of these low stakes, moderate stakes, high stakes engagements that they have to participate in. And it'll become more popular as more people do it. So to conclude, I did promise that I would say just a little bit about why, if I care about a strong, robust, shared democratic identity, I don't have to be telling you that you cannot respect other people. And I'm just going to give you one example of somebody I think we could all learn from. This is Dr. Farmer, the global health pioneer. The reason his story is so interesting is that when he and his group do their work in the world, they start out assuming that maybe they go to Haiti or they go to Rwanda. They don't assume that they're there to bring some knowledge that nobody has ever had. Of course, they're bringing knowledge. Of course, they're sometimes bringing technology and equipment, but they start out saying, look, here are these people who may be needing something. Maybe we can help, but you provide the help in a way that respects their agency. You treat them as potential partners. That's why the group is called Partners in Health. And he even says that when their group goes there, they think of the work they're doing, not as providing aid, but as giving a kind of accompaniment to the work that people are doing. And they draw on local knowledge. They consider whether they're sources of innovation. And they're open to the idea that what they learn in these far-flung places might be something that could reinvigorate our way of life. Then when people move as migrants or they come as immigrants, sometimes in economically well-off positions, but sometimes not, what would our world look like if we all learned how to embody the lessons that come from somebody like Paul Farmer? I really recommend it. The book I most recommend, because it's easy to get into right now, is called To Repair the World. It's his speeches that he gave at graduations over the years. I think really quite good. And then the final bit of advice, I actually say here the physical environment, encourage more reflective relationships. If I could revise it, which I had intended to, it would say to the natural environment. And this is actually, of all people, a climate scientist who's also an evangelical Christian. And she goes around, she talks to groups that do not expect her to have the values that she has, but she says, look, climate change is real. We need to think about stewardship. She finds her values coming actually out of her religion, the notion of stewardship. But she says, I'm a scientist, and I'm telling you, you can't be the steward properly unless you respect fact. She goes around and talks with groups of indigenous people in the US, in Canada, and in other places. And she draws on their local knowledge to shape her understanding of what the climate change activism could look like. She has a concern for justice and how environmental changes affect people in some communities more heavily than others. And she has a humility that you can see it in all of her interactions with people. She has a wonderful website that I like to recommend that students and others actually look at. And then I'll conclude with the idea that the last thing you've got to do, because our political discourse has not done this lately, instead of encouraging despair and anger and fear, you have to encourage hope. I take my lesson from people who've been through much more than many Americans have ever been through, years of prison, racial apartheid, and poverty, et cetera, for the greatest sort. Nelson Mandela, he said, I am not an optimist, but I'm a great believer of hope, right? The idea that even if things aren't going well now, and even if the values you think ought to be realized in the world aren't there now, with your effort and your commitment, it might become possible. And I like the idea of just finishing with a poem. This is also part of my view of what kinds of education we need, which is to take the arts seriously, particularly in democracies. This is one of my favorite poems by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers, perches in the soul, sings the tune without words. It never stops at all. That's that Mandela thing. You never give it up. And I like this stanza. It's sweetest in the gale is heard, and sower must be the storm. that could have bashed the little bird that kept so many warm. In other words, this is something that will stay with you even in the hardest times. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Hope doesn't ask anything of you. It's just there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moody-Adams. This was such an inspiring talk, especially in these dark times.
Thank you.
I am going to invite our students to ask questions. They might need a minute to gather their thoughts.
It doesn't have to be about this paper either. I'm very flexible.
I can go ahead and ask the first question. I guess I too need to gather my thoughts, but I want to ask you about the absence of something, which is talk of a reason and rationality and epistemic competence and all that, which is part of the question you started with. Right. So yeah, I wonder, it seems very much embedded in a kind of psychological, but also affective landscape, and not so much about the exchange of public reason. So even when you talked about citizen assemblies, you talked about sharing experiences rather than sharing reasons. And I don't think you really talked about persuading people to your side and so on. So I would love to hear a little more about that direction.
Absolutely. So reason is not out of the picture in this view. Particularly in the assemblies, it is critical. I might, if I said share experiences, then I did misspeak, because it is about sharing reasons. And that's why they need the information. That's why they need to have conversations about how to interpret the information and its importance. And in fact, I think, however, that even at the second level of the difficult conversations, where it is more about experience than about reasons, that middle level, the middle stakes conversations, there is a place in the public forum for sharing experiences that have been silenced for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes not. And we're at a point, I think, not just in any single democracy, where reason has not proven capable of conveying to people what it means to be an agent in the world. That means that your ability to reason and your ability to have your reasons shape policy is actually limited, in fact, by your experience. And people, so they need to understand the experience. But no, I'm not against reason. And I understand that one way of interpreting the skepticism that I started out with would be, well, then you need to make people more rational. But I don't think that would be enough. My argument is always, you need to make them understand that the things that bind us are sometimes as much about our ability to imagine ourselves belonging to the same unit. Imagination to me is critical. In some ways, I'm the anti-Rawls, where I think reason is never enough. That's what I would say.
Thank you. There is a question from Adam.
Hello, Dr. Moody-Adams. Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So first off, thank you for the amazing talk. I got a lot out of it. I got a lot of notes of it. But I was wondering, would you be able to provide some more examples of what you call like moderate stakes opportunities? Because I think I get the gist of it, but I was wondering if you had any other example of the one you gave in your talk.
Yeah, so there are people around all sorts of topics. So I talked about the Public Conversations Project, but there are people who sit down and talk about religious differences. People from different religious groups get together and ask, actually, what do they have in common? And should they expect every single religious commitment they have to have a place in the public debate or not? That's another topic around which people talk a lot. Around things like the use of language. This has become a concern in not just any single democratic context, but how we describe other people, the categories we use to label them. There have been public conversations around how to choose language that doesn't ignore difference, but treats it as something that where we describe people by labels that don't demean them and don't immediately eliminate our sense that they matter as fellow citizens. So I think you could pick it on a range of topics. The one group is actually called, I think, Difficult Conversations, but the Public Conversation Project, they were really instrumental in this. And I see that as a very different activity, Adam, from what you would do if you're asking people to decide a policy question. Now, I should say the example I gave you, actually, it was written about at length in the Boston Globe right after it was revealed that they'd been meeting. And there were people who were upset that it did not produce agreement on abortion itself. Should it be allowed legally in this democracy or not? But that wasn't its goal. The citizen assembly is a different, to my mind, phenomenon. This was just the goal of getting people to say, look, you might not agree with me, and I might think you're really wrong on some things, but you're still somebody worthy of my respect as a fellow citizen. Does that help, Adam?
It does. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Esme has a question.
Hi, so my question was, how would you go about handling discussion with individuals who don't have respect for democracy and who don't have respect for human life, like fascists? And do you think that we should be engaging with those individuals and trying to have discussions with them, even if it might pose a risk of legitimizing their harmful viewpoints?
Wow, I think about this all the time. I like to say that within any group, there is always a spectrum, and people fall at different points along that spectrum. And there may well be some people who see themselves as, unavoidably, inescapably committed to fascist, anti-democratic values. My confidence, maybe it's just a hope, is that they are in the minority. I don't deny that they're dangerous. I think we have to assume they are essentially, potentially people who want to terroristically undermine democracy. But I do believe that in that spectrum of people in those groups now, there are a lot of people, and this actually emerged when people began to talk about their involvement in the Capitol January 6th insurrection. Some people were just there because they felt aimless. Here was a group that made them feel valued and respected and worthwhile, and they latched onto it. And if you can intervene in some way, and how to intervene, there's no algorithm for that, there's no formula. Sometimes it has to be the responsibility of their local communities to do that, but the community needs to be empowered. I think just with the knowledge that people do change. You can say, here is so-and-so's cognitive bias at work, but also here was the kind, and this is Professor Delmas's point, the affective dimension of their affiliation with this group. Give them some reason not to feel that they need to identify with that group. I think that happens even when we're not dealing with fascist groups that want to destroy democracy. That antisocial behavior is often, there has to be room for it. You have the right to be antisocial as long as you're not harming somebody else. But when it spills over into harm, you can often sit down and figure it's back to where the gangs, urban gangs. They're about people needing to belong. And you intervene in ways that say, look, we can give you a feeling of belonging and value connected to a group that's less destructive, and that actually might in the end be totally more constructive for you. Does that answer some of your worries? Some people you can't talk to. I am not naive about that, but you have to assume on that spectrum, and this has been shown, there are some you can talk with.
Yes, thank you.
Alexa, can you ask your question?
Hi, yeah. I have two very different questions, but okay, so I'll just read them out loud. So what reforms are needed to protect democracy from disinformation campaigns on social media platforms, such as Facebook and Twitter? And then my second question, which is very different, I know, and it's, is the increased reliance on executive orders and assertions, what we call unitary executive power, signs of new authoritarianism in American government?
Oh, wow. Those are like two of the hardest questions to answer. I'll come back to the social media question because the second one about executive privilege, that does trouble me. And it's been used in some contexts, so particularly in the Obama administration, for instance, with regard to values I share, right? But all along, executive power is being increased. And then once the pattern is established of bypassing democratic shaping of policy, it becomes dangerous when the policies in question are authoritarian. And so I do believe that we need to re-examine, we need citizens groups, much as we have citizens groups that worry about everybody having equal access to voting, the voting, what is it, the League of Women's Voters. We need leagues of voters concerned about protecting genuine democratic decision-making in the level of the political class. On the other one, oh man, I wish I knew. I mean, I think about this all the time. I recently read a book, I won't remember the author's name, about kind of how alternative facts become powerful and interesting to people, but the vehicles through which they do, reshaping them, you know what it will require? It will require people in positions of authority in the corporations that run and mount, on the platforms that offer us access to social media. They have to be made to see that in the end, they will suffer if they contribute continually to ways of sharing information, creating it, content creation that undermine democracy. And it can feel for a while, there was business under Nazi Germany, right? But in the end, the destruction, independent of the evil done to human beings, which to me says enough, but the way their economy was destroyed. They had to they were rebuilt after the war by other people. I've been reading about Konrad Adenauer, who was was he prime minister at the time during the 40s, what they had to do to rebuild that economy. That would be a really important lesson for people to see. Authoritarianism in the end it's good for about 10 years max. But if you want a life and an economy that lives, you need to ask, how do we continue to function as heads of these corporate entities in ways that don't undermine the conditions that actually make us possible for us to exist and make money? So I think you have to enlist them, and you would have to have people internal to organizations willing to push back. Like there have been people at Google who lately have lost their jobs for pushing back, but we need to support them. We need to say, look, they're saying this is wrong. Let's support them. And somebody else should hire every Google, computer scientist who spoke up to them and who spoke back. Is that a good reply?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. So Molly has a mic issue, so I'm going to ask the question she posed here, and it overlaps with some of what you said. How do you contend with the increasingly technological world where individuals are only receiving information that assimilates with their opinion and worldview? In other words, how do you inspire individuals to want to listen to other perspectives when all their information is curated to fit with their own views?
That's another one of those hard questions. And it does have links, obviously, with the issues that Alexa, I think it was Alexa, brought up. This may be the hardest one because so my work on social movements has lately made me see the good and the bad of these filter bubbles, so to speak, that people create through social media, where in an authoritarian regime, it turns out that people on Twitter and Facebook, but especially Twitter, were able to organize to challenge the authorities through the same thing that now we see might be leading to authoritarianism. So much about the Arab Spring depended upon information that made its way that the officials couldn't contain and control. So the problem is, how do you not suppress the good dimensions of the social media platforms and get people out of the filter bubbles, so to speak? That's the phrase I'm no expert, but that's the phrase I hear. I'm not sure I know. And I think it is partly going to be the interventions that we enlist people in local communities to make. And it turns out there actually are. People have been writing about this a lot, how in communities where there's been some major injustice, say, or some economic upheaval, when the community finally says, we want to put our voice out and say this, we can't go on like this. So in Flint, for instance, where the citizens have spoken up and, maybe they're having some effect, or there have been places where sometimes around an injustice, like parts of the South where a local museum in response to some injustice in their community springs up, and they have to talk to each other about how to make that work and how not to offend each other around the history. It has to be at the local level, but on the national front, national scene, that's the wrong phrase, on the national scene, leaders, political statesmen, people who head large corporations that control information, they need to be saying, this is something that matters, showing examples of it for public debate. We have town halls that are kind of phony exercises during the elections. Have a real town hall, one or two, maybe see every year, where people just come together around a topic. And then they would start saying, this is the kind of thing that makes democracy work. I think this is very much in the spirit of John Dewey, these kinds of small scale conversations that people have.
Thanks. Clara, can you ask the question you started posting on the chat?
Yeah, hi, thanks for your talk. I thought it was really great, and I really loved the discussion of the different roles of institutions/players in democracy and what they need to do to participate. So I was just wondering if you could speak on what you think about specifically the role of politicians, and if we need to abolish term limits and put limits on lobbying and campaign funding to sustain democracy, since I know like a lot of the times when we talk about the ways certain Congress people vote, we talk about it in terms of their desire to get themselves reelected more than their desire to vote on behalf of their constituents. So do you think that's like an essential step we need to take to sustain democracy?
Clara, I think it's critical. And I'll even tell you, a few decades back when John Rawls was writing, before Political Liberalism, the book that comes out in the 1980s, he reacted actually in print, it's a very small footnote, but to a Supreme Court decision called Buckley versus Vallejo, I think that's the one, which was just the beginning of this kind of let's let all the money we can in politics. Citizens United is, for me, one of the most anti-democratic. People can hide their contributions. There are the limits that are normally going to be there for ordinary donors are not there, et cetera. We've got to rethink the role of money in politics. I think that the start of that will have to come from the ground up. It's not, the politicians themselves have no incentive right now to do it. I think that's why we are in the US where we are. It's a feedback loop. They're not talking to anybody else outside the donors and their fellow people who take money from the same donors and the same PACs. It has to come from the ground up. And, there are all kinds of political action and activism people could be part of. Some of it should be around making sure our institutions are actually responding to us, limiting the amount of money. I actually think limiting the time that we allow a campaign to go on. People become president, and unless they're Biden's age, the day they take office, they're thinking about the next election. Senators, congressmen, in the American scene, it's like this is not my phrase, it comes from Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson. Actually, it's not in that book, it's in their book on compromise, if you're interested in this. They call it the permanent campaign. It's not just that you're not going to compromise, it's that you're not listening to anybody but your donors. And so we need to shorten, in Britain, you have 6 weeks for a parliamentary election, 6 weeks. Other countries have equally confined terms. Now on term limits, I'm less sure on that. That's something where I haven't read as much as I'd like to, because I think here's where I think Schumpeter, the guy who wrote the Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, the only thing I think he got right, I do think it's our job to say, let's vote the bums out. Because it might be somebody you think is really great. If you have a term limit suddenly, and maybe they're still young, maybe they started young, you might really end up regretting having instituted something that takes your decision-making process from you. I mean, I am a Democrat with a small d all the way down. I say it's our job. If they're doing a bad job, you're out. And not to put an artificial limit that wouldn't leave it open, that if they're doing a great job, they could stay until we mutually realized it was time for them to quit. I think I answered every feature of your question. I said the term limits I'm still working on. You probably have a better handle on it than I do. But I've known, like I think about, you know, 4 terms of, well, not everybody loved Franklin Roosevelt. He was not a perfect person, but he could do a lot in the 3, he didn't finish the 4th term, obviously, but he did a lot that he couldn't have done in 2 terms. I think that 3rd term in particular turned out to be critical.
Thank you. Keelan.
Yeah, hi. So I am really interested in what you said about civic engagement, particularly the part about difficult conversations. That's something I focus a lot in social justice work and stuff like that.
Wow.
So also kind of calling back to Esme's earlier question about people that might be very anti-democratic or, not valuing human life very much. I personally think that like empathy is a great tool for collaboration and connection, but also at the same time, I know that at a psychological basis, there's sometimes some distinctions. So there's something referred to as like the window of tolerance for these kind of trauma-informed conversations where if people are like more in a hyperactive space or a less active space, they can't critically engage in a conversation. And there's some people that kind of sit in those spaces at all times. So I'm also kind of worried about, I guess, the safety of difficult conversations. Obviously, like you mentioned, having them in a more controlled environment, but sometimes people really revert to a more base level instinctual response, kind of the flight or fight mode that we often refer to just in daily conversations. So how do you think would be the best way to navigate those situations? And then
Wow.
2 other kind of related questions are, do individuals have a duty to engage with other people? And do they have a duty to engage with dangerous people? And also, how does that kind of interact with the hierarchy between like oppressed people and their oppressors? Do those people then have a duty to, have those conversations with the very groups that oppressed them?
Wow. Really, really hard questions around what is, I think, a very important dimension of what we need to do to reinvigorate democracy. I'll say to the 3rd part, talking to dangerous people, I don't think anybody's required to do that. I mean, some people have the jobs that requires them to do that, but if that's not your job, if you didn't choose that, I would say no. And I think I can do this and not undercut the value of everything else, because I don't think in the end, everybody is going to be dangerous in that way. There will be some. I also think, secondly, you hinted at something that I would not be averse to using for some interactions, and that's occasionally a little bit of anonymity, privacy, confidentiality of some groups, as long as they were willing when they left the group, because this conversation, if you get a chance, I think it's no longer behind the Boston Globe paywall, but if not, I can send my copy to Professor Delmas later, maybe tomorrow or something. It was called Talking with the Enemy. And it was months and months, maybe it was even years. It started right after that shooting. And they did not, both of them worried about their credibility on the groups, both sides. So they didn't want it to get out. There would be people who might try to disrupt it. But so much that we don't know happened in there that just lowered the violence. People feared in '94, it could be like a shooting war. And it's one person sets an example, I'm angry, so I use my violent response to, you found it, yay. And others might not themselves be violent, but they might be afraid of violence and so not talk. So you might need to shield some people temporarily. That might be where the moderate stakes and the low stakes opportunities might need to come closer together, where to make it little lower stakes on the moderate end, on the moderate kind, you give people a little protection for a while. When it comes to people who are oppressed, there's a lot that I would say. It's very complicated. One of the things I always admired, but not everybody can do it, that there were some people in the civil rights movement, just to give one example. One of them was Martin Luther King. He was not afraid to talk to anybody. That doesn't mean that all of us can be. He was an unusual fellow, right? I'll say that. Was, again, not a perfect guy, but in some ways morally, wow, he's somebody I would in some regards think is a very unusual presence in the world. I grew up in Chicago, and he was not afraid to go in 1966 walking through segregated neighborhoods with he was accompanied by priests and nuns from the neighborhood, but he was not afraid to walk through. He didn't change the world with that, but it sent a message that, look, we're here. We expect to be accommodated. And it made Mayor Daley, who was then the mayor, the first Mayor Daley, the more famous of the two, Richard Daley, made him listen. There's disagreement about whether what agreement they came up with was substantive enough, but people listened because they said, this guy is not afraid of anybody. He had rocks thrown as I wouldn't have done it, but I think we need some people who have that kind of courage to be the vanguard, if you will. You know, and there's different ways of being vanguard. So the Black Power movement, again, I'm from Chicago, so, you know, Fred Hampton, some of you may even have seen the movie, the Judas and the Black Messiah. Fred Hampton was another kind of vanguard. There has to be vanguard figures. The rest of us can't do it, but they have difficult conversations. He actually did talk sometimes with white groups. People thought the Black Panthers were all about talking only to Black people. They didn't. They talked to everybody. So that's what I would say. Some people are going to be in the vanguard. The rest of us will hope that we can follow on in an opening of space they help create. Some of that space might need to be protected space, at least for a while. But when we leave it and we go back and forth, we should be taking the lessons of our interactions with us. And, you know, and if you're in a group that's in favor of abortion, if you're lower your anti-abortion rhetoric, not say, oh, they're hateful people. If you're in a group that's an anti-abortion group, not saying, oh, they're evil people. That's where it's the slow lowering of the volume that might allow other more constructive conversation to take place.
Thank you. Lion, it's your turn.
What great questions. I feel like invigorated myself. Wow.
And about technocratic leaders in a lot of they sometimes can be very political. Since Italian Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, President Draghi, who used to be the ECB, so he has a lot of competence in dealing with a lot of issues. What do you think about, like, in a democratic society? Like we're thinking that everything should people decide, right? Even though we have a representative democracy, we think a lot of times also people choose what kind of leader they want to lead. But how does that coincide with the need of technocratic political leaders at a time of crisis? Or how do we lead to a more economic growth? We need someone with more ability and economic skills, right, in terms of making more policy, rather than just a politician people just like about that way of speech.
That is such a great question. And I'm glad you asked it, because the one slide that was in the other version of the talk that I was, it would have talked a little bit about this. So this was actually part of the debate between John Dewey and Walter Lippmann. It's also in John Stuart Mill in the Considerations on Representative Government. The democracy cannot work in a complex modern environment with all the different moving pieces there are, and as you said, economic issues where people need expertise, et cetera. Now we need scientific expertise if there's a pandemic. We need a Dr. Fauci as much as we need a politician. I recognize that need, maybe especially at the level, I'll say, of the political class democracy, and I think even middle democracy. Some experts have got to be trusted, relied upon, turned to. My only worry, this is John Dewey talking to Walter Lippmann, is that when it comes to understanding why we need the experts in the first place, we cannot ignore the knowledge, the experience, the claims of ordinary people. Here's John Dewey's phrase. This is actually I think it's from The Public and the Problems. He says, look, the expert may know how to make a better shoe, how to make it more effectively and efficiently and cheaper, but only the citizen who has to wear the shoe knows where the shoe pinches. I love that phrase from Dewey. You know where it pinches, the other group knows how to make it better and not make it hurt, etc. But I think both standpoints are critical, and you're right. And we have a very challenging set of concerns. I'm glad you mentioned the new Italian prime minister, but as I said, the pandemic has, to me, even for somebody like me who tended to occasionally say, oh, we don't really need experts so much. I'm glad there's somebody there who's thinking about how to fund and make and whatever vaccines, how to distribute them, even the understanding of how to distribute them in a way that's fair, given the range of populations and how some things have to be transported at a certain temperature. But Liana, I think it's really, really critical that you never lose sight of the ways in which what needs to be done is only fully understood when citizens speak up too. But it's a brilliant question. As I said, I felt bad that I didn't have the opportunity to say, yeah, I know this matters. So thank you.
Jax.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is kind of based on, I think in a previous Q&A, or the question before, a couple questions ago, you briefly mentioned the right to be antisocial. And I'm kind of wondering, how do you balance this right, or just the idea that you can be an antisocial person, we can enforce that onto someone, with the need for active participation in a democracy. Kind of going off that view on the idea that some people may not want to govern themselves, and how can we instill within citizens a willingness to participate in democracy, especially as capitalism and individualism kind of seem to work against this?
Wow. I saw your question actually pop up in the chat, and I said, oh, I hope I had a chance to answer it, because this is another really double-sided issue. Because when I said that people have a right to be antisocial, I meant that they not only have a right not to want to be, deeply engaged the way we hope most citizens want to be, in all those 4 levels, if possible, of citizen level democracy. We need people who stand outside as potential critics, who may have to be or feel kind of alienated from the ordinary everyday. I think actually, so again, this is, I think, work that ideas that may connect up with some of Professor Delmas's work. The people who tell us, like a Thoreau or a Gandhi or a King, or I've mentioned Fred Hampton, I mean, I could give you or Mandela, that something about our institutions is deeply amiss. Maybe it's the values that govern them. Maybe it's not the values. Maybe it's the way we don't understand how to realize the value. Whatever it is, we need some people who will seem antisocial, who will be, in some sense, alienated from their societies, because they can step back enough to see where the imperfections and inadequacies and deficiencies are. And I'm not saying every antisocial person is a potential social critic of value, but I'd rather have a society that made room for a Thoreau who says, look, do you really want to support slavery? Do you want to pay your tax to this? Or a King who says, do you want to support injustice? And he's, people thought when I was younger, ordinary citizens, quote unquote, who were not African-American, and some African-American, thought he was dangerous. He was upsetting the apple cart, right? That's antisocial. But we need some antisocial people. And I think we have to take the good antisocial, potentially good, with the kind of, I just don't want to be bothered antisocial. I'm really glad you asked that. Everybody can't be, or we would have no, functioning institutions. But if somebody at least isn't, our institutions will go awry and we are going to be too embedded in them. I think even to have the time to step aside and criticize. And we need some people who are Socrates, right, who are antisocial to tell us that sometimes we do things wrong.
Okay, may I ask the last question? It's
Sure.
time, it's one, maybe some people have to go now, but I'd really like to ask the question, and it connects with Jax's question and your answer. So a lot of dissent is itself construed as uncivil, right? And that's what you're talking about here with the critiques, the social critiques who appear as antisocial. But I want to add too that among those you mentioned, including Fred Hampton, there was no commitment to civility. So there was a real effort. So right. So I love your talk, but as you know, like I defend incivility, but there was a real willingness, I mean, an effort to repair democracy and repair the civic bonds that tie us together. But there was no commitment to doing so through civility. Now, here what matters is both the fact that even when they were trying to do so civilly, they were construed as uncivil, and that's the case for much of the mainstream civil rights movement, not just those on the closer to the Black Power movement. And it connects also with your emphasis on civic sacrifice. So we will soon read in the class Juliet Hooker's piece on Black Lives Matter, who talks about the white and inability and unwillingness to recognize the sacrifices made by Blacks and the ways in which it just prevents a fair distribution of burdens and benefits. And it also, in her view, grounds these expressions of anger and rage that we see in the current movement. And that goes against some of what you're saying we need to do, but it's fit in all kinds of ways. So if you can just address that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. The last chapter of the book I'm working on will actually talk about anger and rage and as political forces when they are valuable and maybe sometimes when they're not. I acknowledge that they are. The interesting thing, King was about as angry a person as you could find. He just had a different vision of how that anger should shape his sort of public persona in the world. But it's anger balanced with hope, to me, is in the end the only way to realize longer term the goals. That's why I mentioned Mandela, right? You wouldn't find an angrier person willing to do and engage in uncivil, right, activity. But then the time comes when you say, well, if this anger has had the effect that I needed in the short run for it to have, now there's power to be taken up. How do I take up that power? How do I exercise power in this political system if my anger is always overtaking me? That's why I mentioned Mandela, right? There's that moment when he ascends to the presidency, when he kind of tries to make peace, right, with white South Africans on a rugby field of all things. And I'll even say, I just recently finished a big book about the Black Power movement. I won't remember the title right now. It's a wonderful book by a pair of historians who were trying to really give you the big picture of the movement. I forget the title now. I've read like 12 books about the Panthers in the last month. But one of the things that's interesting is that the Panthers themselves were always balancing the incivility part with feeding kids in, school and having schools, education. Some of them even later. So Lane Brown in, California or Oakland, I guess it is, decides to run for office. There were always two strands of their project. And we only saw in the media the uncivil part. there's a place for it. So the last thing I'll say too is that the civil rights movement would never have had its effect but for the quote unquote threat, quote unquote, of Black power, the kind of radical flank effect phenomenon. That doesn't mean that's all it's valuable for. But I think no social movement ever works if everybody thinks, oh, they're all sweet and kind and nice. There has to be this framing. If you don't do this, our anger, which is genuine and justified and real, our anger lead us in places none of us really want to go. And so I said, that's why for me, the balance in the movement, I even knew somebody who was in the Black Power movement. I knew them later, not while they were in it, but I knew them in college. And this was somebody, her name is actually Lynn French. You can find her in a video interview online. And she talked about this balance between the uncivil part and the let's just feed kids part. And let's just educate them. Let's try in our own way to reshape the system in a quieter way that people don't always see. Is that an answer that helps? That's a question I really, and I've struggled with it. Absolutely.
No, wonderful answer. Thank you so much. And thank you for your talk. It was really illuminating and so timely and I really inspiring.